The morning sunlight poured through the large glass windows of the downtown office building, casting long golden streaks across the polished marble floors. It was a busy day at Bright Future Enterprises, a well-known firm in the city. The company's HR department buzzed with activity as applicants shuffled in, clutching resumes and wearing hopeful smiles. Among them was Nina Carter, a poised and determined woman in her late 30s, dressed in a crisp navy blue blazer that exuded professionalism. Her natural curls framed her confident face, but behind her composed demeanor was a blend of excitement and nerves. Nina had spent weeks preparing for this opportunity. She believed in her skills and experience, knowing they aligned perfectly with the managerial position advertised by Bright Future. Years of hard work, long nights earning her MBA, and leading teams in challenging roles had brought her to this moment. This was her chance to step into a leadership role in a prestigious company, something she had been dreaming of for years. As Nina approached the receptionist, her warm smile lit up the room. "Good morning, I'm here to submit my application for the managerial position," she said, handing over her carefully prepared documents. The receptionist, a young woman with a friendly demeanor, nodded and gestured toward a waiting area. "You're all set. Someone from HR will collect it shortly," she replied. Nina thanked her and took a seat, clutching her bag while scanning the room. Across the hallway, Greg Thompson, the head of HR, was reviewing resumes. Greg was a man known for his sharp tongue and quick judgments. Middle-aged with a sharp suit and a colder attitude, he often carried an air of arrogance that intimidated even the most confident candidates. Despite his position, Greg wasn't exactly known for fairness. Moments later, the receptionist handed Greg Nina's application. He glanced at it briefly, then froze. His eyes scanned the name, the background, and her attached photo. A smirk crept across his face as he leaned back in his chair, holding her resume with 2 fingers as if it were an unwanted flyer. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. "Unqualified. We don't need people like her wasting our time." Without hesitation, Greg crumpled Nina's resume and tossed it into the trash. The sound of the paper hitting the bottom of the bin was subtle, but it carried the weight of dismissal, rejection, and prejudice. Greg's assistant, who had witnessed the act, shifted uncomfortably but didn't dare speak up. Greg was a powerful man in the company, and challenging him was a risky move. Unaware of what had just transpired, Nina waited patiently in the lobby, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and hope. She glanced at the clock on the wall, wondering how soon she might hear back. To her, this was a step closer to fulfilling her dreams. Little did Greg know, this seemingly ordinary candidate held a secret that would shake the very foundation of the company. As the hours ticked by, whispers of a high-profile leadership announcement began circulating through the office corridors. Speculations ran wild. Rumors of a new CEO who would soon be taking over Bright Future Enterprises. Employees buzzed with excitement and nervous energy, wondering who the mysterious figure could be. Meanwhile, Nina left the building, still optimistic about her chances. She didn't need to know the events unfolding behind closed doors. Her focus remained on her goals. But fate had a way of bringing justice where it was due. By the time Greg sat down for his afternoon meeting, the announcement was imminent. His confidence, however, remained unshaken. After all, he had always believed he was untouchable. What Greg didn't realize was that the person walking through the boardroom doors that afternoon would leave him speechless, his arrogance replaced by disbelief. And Nina. She wasn't just an applicant. She was the one who would soon decide Greg's future. As Greg settled into his chair at the long mahogany table in the boardroom, he exuded his usual confidence, barely glancing at the other department heads filing in. The room was abuzz with low murmurs as senior managers exchanged curious glances. The air was thick with anticipation. Everyone was eager to learn about the rumored leadership change. Greg, however, remained indifferent. He had always believed his position was secure, his influence untouchable. Across the city, Nina sat in a quiet cafe, sipping her favorite latte and going over her notes for the day. She had always been meticulous, a trait that had served her well in her career. Her mind wandered back to the people she had met during her earlier visit to Bright Future Enterprises. The receptionist had been polite, the atmosphere professional. She felt optimistic about the company, even as she wasn't sure how her application had been received. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from a close friend, congratulating her on her recent success. Nina smiled faintly. Despite the challenges she had faced, she had managed to climb higher than many had expected. Every step forward had been a testament to her resilience and unwavering determination. But today she wasn't thinking about her accomplishments. Today she was just another job applicant trying to make her way into a company she admired. Back in the boardroom, the tension was palpable. The CEO's assistant entered, carrying a folder and a calm, authoritative presence. She moved to the front of the room, where a sleek presentation screen had been set up. The chatter in the room died down instantly. "Good afternoon, everyone," the assistant began, her voice steady and professional. "Thank you for gathering on such short notice. As you all know, Bright Future Enterprises is entering a new chapter of growth and innovation. To lead us through this transformative period, the board has selected a new CEO, someone with a bold vision and the ability to inspire change." Greg leaned back in his chair, suppressing a yawn. He had seen plenty of leadership changes in his career and didn't expect this one to be any different. Still, he couldn't help but wonder who the board had chosen. Perhaps another corporate type, someone who would rely on him to keep the day-to-day operations running smoothly. The assistant continued, "Our new CEO brings a wealth of experience, a proven track record of leadership, and a deep commitment to fostering diversity and inclusion within the workplace." At this, Greg's ears perked up. He had heard those words before, buzzwords that companies like to throw around to appear progressive. He smirked inwardly, already dismissing the idea that this new CEO could bring anything groundbreaking to the table. The assistant paused for effect, glancing at her notes. "Please join me in welcoming Nina Carter as the new CEO of Bright Future Enterprises." The room fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Greg's smirk froze on his face, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. Surely this was some kind of mistake. Nina Carter. The name echoed in his mind, dragging up the memory of the resume he had crumpled and discarded earlier that day. His heart sank as he realized the gravity of his actions. Before he could fully grasp the situation, the doors to the boardroom opened, and Nina walked in. Her confident stride and warm smile immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the room. She was no longer the hopeful applicant sitting in the lobby, waiting for an opportunity. She was the woman who would now lead the company. Nina's eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of her new team. She recognized Greg immediately, though she gave no indication of it. She had seen his name on the company's organizational chart during her research, and his reputation had preceded him. Nina knew exactly who he was and what kind of man she was dealing with. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and self-assured. "It's an honor to be here and to have the opportunity to lead Bright Future Enterprises into its next phase of success. I've spent my career focused on building strong teams, driving innovation, and creating environments where everyone has the chance to thrive. I'm excited to bring that vision here." As Nina spoke, Greg shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found. He avoided eye contact, hoping she wouldn't recognize him, or worse, remember him. Nina continued, "I believe that every individual in this company has the potential to contribute something valuable. My goal is to ensure that every voice is heard, every effort is recognized, and every employee feels empowered to reach their fullest potential." Her words were met with a round of polite applause, though the tension in the room was still palpable. Nina's calm demeanor belied the storm brewing beneath the surface. She wasn't here to settle scores, not yet. She was here to lead, to make a difference, and to prove that she belonged in this role as much as anyone else. After the meeting, Greg retreated to his office, his mind racing. He replayed the events of the day, from dismissing her application to watching her take her place at the head of the table. How could he have been so blind? Meanwhile, Nina returned to her temporary office, a quiet space set aside for her transition period. She sat at her desk, reflecting on the day's events. She had felt the weight of the room's energy, the unspoken doubts and judgments. But she had also felt a sense of purpose, a resolve to show everyone, not just Greg, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the afternoon turned into evening, Nina began reviewing the company's policies, familiarizing herself with its strengths and areas for improvement. She knew this was just the beginning of her journey at Bright Future. There would be challenges ahead, but she was ready for them. And as for Greg, he couldn't shake the feeling that his actions had set something in motion, something he couldn't control. The days following Nina's introduction as CEO brought a whirlwind of activity to Bright Future Enterprises. Her presence was both a breath of fresh air and a storm of uncertainty for many employees. Some welcomed the change, excited by her vision and the energy she brought to the table. Others, particularly those who had grown comfortable under the old regime, eyed her warily, unsure of what her leadership would mean for them. For Greg, the tension was unbearable. He avoided Nina whenever possible, taking alternate routes through the building and delegating tasks that might require him to interact with her directly. But the avoidance only heightened his anxiety. Every time he saw her walking through the halls, greeting employees with genuine warmth or meeting with department heads, he was reminded of the moment he had dismissed her application without a second thought. What haunted him most was the possibility that she knew what he had done. Did she recognize him? Was she deliberately giving him space, waiting for the right moment to confront him? These questions gnawed at him, making it impossible to focus on his work. Meanwhile, Nina was settling into her role with a quiet determination. She spent her first week meeting with employees at all levels of the company, from interns to senior executives. She listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions and taking detailed notes. It didn't take long for her to notice patterns: departments that lacked diversity, policies that disproportionately favored certain groups, and a culture that, while not overtly toxic, was far from inclusive. One of her first initiatives was to implement a series of anonymous feedback sessions, where employees could share their experiences and concerns without fear of reprisal. The results were eye-opening. Stories of favoritism, overlooked talent, and subtle biases poured in, painting a picture of a company that had thrived on the surface but struggled with deeper issues. Among the feedback was a recurring theme: Greg Thompson. Multiple employees described him as dismissive, unapproachable, and resistant to change. Some even hinted at moments of overt prejudice, though they stopped short of making formal complaints. Nina read these accounts with a mixture of sadness and resolve. She had suspected Greg might be a problem, but the extent of his influence was more troubling than she had anticipated. Still, Nina chose not to act immediately. She knew that addressing systemic issues required patience and strategy. Confronting Greg directly could backfire, especially without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Instead, she focused on building trust with her team and gathering the information she needed to make informed decisions. Greg, oblivious to the feedback sessions, continued to grapple with his own paranoia. He began to notice small changes around the office: a shift in the way people spoke about Nina, a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. It unnerved him. For years, he had been the gatekeeper, the one who decided who deserved a chance and who didn't. Now, it felt like that power was slipping away. One afternoon, Greg received an unexpected invitation to a one-on-one meeting with Nina. His heart sank as he read the email, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a stone. He couldn't ignore it. That much was clear. But as he prepared for the meeting, he found himself rehearsing excuses, trying to frame his actions in a way that would protect him as she brought up the discarded application. When the time came, Greg walked into Nina's office with a forced smile, his palms damp with sweat. She greeted him warmly, motioning for him to take a seat. Her demeanor was calm, professional, and unreadable, which only heightened his anxiety. "Thank you for meeting with me, Greg," Nina began, folding her hands on the desk. "I've been spending a lot of time learning about the company and its people, and I wanted to get your perspective as someone who's been here for a while." Greg nodded, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. "Of course," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I'm happy to provide any insight you need." Their conversation started innocuously enough, touching on company history, challenges in the HR department, and areas for potential growth. But as the minutes ticked by, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that Nina was steering the discussion towards something more personal. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady but not unkind. "Greg, I've heard a lot about you from your colleagues," she said. "You've been a significant part of this company for many years, and your contributions haven't gone unnoticed. But I also believe in transparency and accountability, and I want to make sure we're fostering an environment where everyone feels valued and respected." Greg's stomach churned. He couldn't tell if her words were a prelude to a reprimand or simply an observation. He nodded, choosing his response carefully. "I completely agree, Nina. Creating a positive workplace culture is crucial, and I'm committed to supporting that vision." Nina smiled faintly, her expression giving nothing away. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "I think we have an opportunity to make this company even better, but it's going to require all of us to be honest with ourselves and open to change." The meeting ended without any direct mention of the discarded application, leaving Greg both relieved and unsettled. He couldn't tell if Nina was playing a long game or if she truly didn't know what he had done. Either way, he resolved to be more cautious moving forward. But Nina wasn't done. In the days that followed, she quietly began gathering more information about Greg's behavior and its impact on the company. She reviewed hiring records, spoke with employees in confidence, and paid close attention to how he interacted with others during meetings. At the same time, she continued to build alliances within the company, earning the trust and respect of her team. Her leadership style was collaborative and empathetic, a stark contrast to the rigid hierarchy that had defined Bright Future for so long. The tension between Nina and Greg simmered beneath the surface, unspoken but ever present. Each interaction was a subtle dance, a test of wills that left both of them wondering what the next move would be. And as the weeks went on, it became increasingly clear that their conflict was more than just a personal clash. It was a reflection of the broader changes sweeping through the company, a battle between the old guard and the new, between complacency and progress, between fear and hope. For Nina, the stakes were high, but she was determined to prove that she was not only qualified for the role, but also capable of transforming Bright Future into a place where everyone, regardless of their background, could thrive. And for Greg, the walls were closing in. The question wasn't whether he would face the consequences of his actions, but when. Weeks passed, and the tension between Nina and Greg became a quiet undercurrent in the office. Employees noticed the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The way Greg avoided Nina in meetings, the way Nina's gaze sometimes lingered on him, assessing but never accusing. Conversations in the break room hinted at something brewing, though no one could quite put their finger on what it was. Nina, for her part, continued her work with a laser focus. She dove deep into the company's operations, uncovering practices that needed reform and identifying areas where Bright Future could thrive. But as much as she was committed to the company's success, she couldn't ignore the shadow Greg cast over her plans. His influence, though waning, still had the potential to undermine the progress she envisioned. One morning, Nina received an email that stopped her in her tracks. It was from a former employee, someone who had left the company years ago, but had heard through the grapevine about the changes happening under her leadership. The email detailed a pattern of behavior that confirmed what Nina had already begun to suspect about Greg. It wasn't just his dismissive attitude or his resistance to change. It was a deeper issue, one that had affected the careers and lives of countless employees. The email included specific incidents, names, and dates. It was a damning account of favoritism, bias, and missed opportunities for talented individuals who didn't fit Greg's narrow definition of what qualified looked like. As Nina read the words, a sense of anger and responsibility settled over her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the culture of the company and the people who had been hurt by it. But Nina knew she couldn't act on this information impulsively. She needed to corroborate the claims, to build a case that was indisputable. She reached out to the company's legal and HR teams, framing her inquiries carefully to avoid tipping her hand too soon. She also continued her conversations with employees, paying close attention to the stories they shared and the patterns that emerged. Meanwhile, Greg was growing increasingly paranoid. He noticed Nina's subtle but consistent focus on areas of the company that intersected with his responsibilities. Her questions, always polite and professional, seemed designed to peel back layers he'd long kept hidden. He began to dread their interactions, feeling as though each meeting was a step closer to some inevitable reckoning. One afternoon, Greg's fears were compounded when he overheard a conversation between two junior employees in the hallway. They were discussing an upcoming town hall meeting Nina had scheduled, an open forum where employees could ask questions and share their thoughts directly with her. "She's not afraid to tackle the tough stuff," one of them said. "I've heard she's been looking into the hiring process and why so many good candidates get turned away." Greg's heart sank. He had always been careful to keep his decisions under the radar, to frame his rejections as a matter of fit or qualifications. But he knew that if Nina was digging into hiring practices, it was only a matter of time before she uncovered the truth. The town hall took place in the company's largest conference room, with employees spilling out into the hallways and tuning in via livestream. Nina stood at the front, her presence commanding but approachable. She began with a speech about the company's values and her vision for the future, emphasizing transparency, accountability, and inclusivity. As she spoke, Greg sat near the back, his palms sweaty and his thoughts racing. He couldn't decide whether to ask a question, to try to steer the conversation away from the topics he feared, or to stay silent and hope to remain unnoticed. Then, an employee raised their hand and brought up the topic Greg had been dreading. "I heard a lot of talk about how we can improve diversity in hiring," they said. "But what about the candidates who never make it past the first round? Are we doing enough to make sure we're not overlooking talent?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Nina, who nodded thoughtfully before responding. "That's an excellent question," she said. "It's something I've been investigating closely since I joined Bright Future. Hiring is one of the most critical ways we shape our company's culture and future, and it's essential that we approach it with fairness and integrity. She paused, letting her words sink in. I've already identified some areas where we can improve, including how we evaluate applications and the criteria we use to determine who moves forward in the process. These changes won't happen overnight, but I'm committed to ensuring that every candidate is given a fair shot. Greg felt a chill run down his spine. The calm conviction in Nina's voice left no doubt that she knew more than she was letting on. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, hoping the moment would pass without further scrutiny. But Nina wasn't done. I also want to emphasize that accountability applies to all of us, myself included. If there are practices or decisions that don't align with our values, we need to address them, no matter where they come from. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Though she hadn't named names or pointed fingers, the message was clear. Change was coming, and no one was above it. As the town hall wrapped up, Greg slipped out of the room, avoiding eye contact with his colleagues. He knew he was running out of time, but he didn't know what to do. Confronting Nina was out of the question, and denying his actions felt increasingly futile. Nina, meanwhile, returned to her office with a renewed sense of purpose. She could feel the momentum building, the tide shifting in favor of a more inclusive and equitable workplace. But she also knew that the hardest part was still ahead, the moment when she would have to confront Greg directly and decide how to address the harm he had caused. The tension between them had reached a boiling point, and everyone in the company could sense it. The question wasn't if the conflict would come to a head, but when, and what the fallout would be when it did. The unease around the office only grew in the days following the town hall. Employees whispered in hushed tones, speculating about what Nina's investigations might uncover. Greg, unable to shake the feeling that his past decisions were closing in on him, found himself working late hours, poring over old files to ensure there was nothing left that could incriminate him. But the truth had already taken root in places he couldn't control, and each passing day seemed to tighten the noose around him. Nina, too, felt the pressure mounting. While she had made significant progress in understanding the systemic issues within the company, she was acutely aware that her actions had placed her in the spotlight. Every decision she made was scrutinized, every move analyzed. She had expected resistance, but what she didn't anticipate was the sudden reappearance of someone from her past who could complicate everything. It happened one crisp Friday morning, just as the office was settling into its usual rhythm. Nina was reviewing reports when her assistant knocked lightly on her door. "There's someone here to see you," they said, their tone hesitant. "They're going to have an appointment, but they said it's urgent." Nina frowned. She wasn't in the habit of entertaining unannounced visitors, especially on busy days like this. But something in her assistant's demeanor made her pause. "Who is it?" she asked. "They said their name is Marcus Irvine." The assistant replied, their voice low. "They claimed to have worked for Bright Future years ago." Nina's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't heard that name in over a decade, but she remembered it well. Marcus had been a mentor to her in the early days of her career, a sharp, ambitious executive who had taken her under his wing when others had dismissed her potential. But his sudden departure from Bright Future had been shrouded in mystery, and she had never learned the full story. "Send him in," Nina said, her mind racing. Moments later, Marcus stepped into the room, his presence as commanding as she remembered. His hair was grayer now, his face lined with age, but his sharp eyes still held the same intensity. He greeted her warmly, though there was an undercurrent of urgency in his demeanor. "It's been a long time, Nina," he said, taking a seat across from her. "I've been following your career. I have to say, I'm not surprised to see you here." Nina smiled, though her curiosity was piqued. "It's good to see you too, Marcus. But I have to admit, I wasn't expecting this. What brings you back to Bright Future after all these years?" Marcus' expression grew serious. "I heard about the changes you're making, and I knew I needed to talk to you. There's something you need to know about this company, about why I left." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "When I was here, I started noticing patterns, similar to what you've likely seen. Hiring biases, promotions going to the same type of people, talented employees being pushed out. I tried to address it, but the resistance I faced was overwhelming. Eventually, it became clear that certain people in power, were willing to go to great lengths to maintain the status quo." Nina listened intently, her mind racing to connect the dots. "Are you saying they forced you out?" she asked. Marcus nodded, "In a way. They didn't fire me outright, but they made it impossible for me to stay. Projects were taken away from me, my decisions were undermined, and eventually I realized I had no choice but to leave. But before I did, I uncovered something. something I couldn't prove at the time but that I think is still relevant now." He pulled a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the desk to Nina. Inside were documents, emails, and meeting notes that painted a damning picture of systemic bias and manipulation within the company. At the center of it all was Greg Thompson, who had been climbing the corporate ladder even then. Nina felt a wave of anger and disbelief as she scanned the contents. Marcus' evidence confirmed her worst suspicions about Greg and revealed a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. But it also raised new questions. If this information had been available all this time, why hadn't anyone acted on it? And what would it take to finally hold Greg accountable? As she absorbed the implications of Marcus' revelations, Nina realized that the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about Greg or even Bright Future. It was about setting a precedent for accountability and justice. But she also knew that exposing the truth would come with risks, not just for her but for everyone involved. Meanwhile, Greg was facing his own crisis. Unbeknownst to him, rumors of his questionable practices had begun to circulate among the staff. Employees who had once been too afraid to speak up were now emboldened by Nina's leadership, sharing their experiences and supporting one another. The walls Greg had built around himself were starting to crumble, and he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. Late one evening, as he sat alone in his office, Greg received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "You know what you did." The message was brief but chilling. "Time's up. The truth will come out." Greg's hands trembled as he stared at the screen. He couldn't tell if it was a prank or a genuine threat, but either way, it left him shaken. He knew he needed to act fast, but he didn't know where to begin. The secrets he had buried were no longer safe, and the consequences of his actions were finally catching up to him. As the tension between Nina and Greg reached a breaking point, the entire company braced for what was to come. Employees sensed that something big was about to happen, though they couldn't have guessed the twists that lay ahead. Nina was preparing to make a move, armed with the truth and the support of those who believed in her vision. And Greg, desperate to protect himself, was willing to do whatever it took to maintain his position. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the course of Bright Future forever. But just as the pieces seemed to fall into place, an unexpected twist threatened to upend everything, leaving both Nina and Greg to question how far they were willing to go to fight for what they believed in. The day of the board meeting arrived, casting an air of unease over Bright Future's headquarters. Employees whispered in corridors, speculating about the agenda. There had been no official notice, but the energy in the building made it clear that something significant was about to unfold. Greg, pale and jittery, sat at the head of the table, trying to project the confidence he no longer felt. Nina entered the boardroom with calm determination, accompanied by Marcus, who had been invited to present his findings. She carried the folder of evidence Marcus had given her, along with the corroborative data she had gathered. The board members exchanged glances, sensing the gravity of the moment, but unsure of what was about to transpire. As the meeting began, Greg tried to steer the conversation toward routine matters, but Nina interrupted. "Before we proceed, there's something that needs to be addressed," she said, her voice steady. Greg's smile faltered. "Is this really the time for personal grievances?" he asked, his tone dismissive. "This isn't personal," Nina replied, her eyes locking onto his. "It's about the integrity of this company and the people who have been affected by decisions made under your leadership." She turned to the board. "Over the past several weeks, I've been reviewing Bright Future's hiring practices and overall culture. What I found is deeply troubling. Bias, exclusion, and systemic barriers have prevented talented individuals from contributing to this company's success. And the person responsible for many of these practices is sitting right here." Gasps rippled through the room as Nina presented her evidence. She spoke with clarity and precision, detailing the patterns of discrimination and favoritism that had defined Greg's tenure. Marcus followed, providing first-hand accounts and supporting documentation that painted a damning picture. Greg's face turned a deep shade of red. "This is absurd," he blustered, his voice rising. "These are baseless accusations. You're trying to undermine me because you want my position." Nina didn't flinch. "This isn't about power," she said. "It's about accountability. And it's about ensuring that the values we claim to uphold are reflected in our actions." The board members listened intently, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. Some had suspected issues within the company but hadn't realized the extent of the problem. Others seemed genuinely blindsided by the revelations. Just as it seemed Greg was out of options, he played his final card. "If you're going to point fingers, Nina, maybe we should talk about your past," he said, his tone venomous. After all, nobody's perfect, are they? The room fell silent. Nina's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly recovered. If you have something to say, Greg, say it, she challenged, her voice unwavering. Greg smirked, clearly relishing the moment. I happen to know about a certain incident from your early career, an oversight that cost a client significant money. Funny how that didn't make it into your glowing reputation, isn't it? Nina took a deep breath. Yes, I made a mistake early in my career, she admitted, her honesty disarming. I owned up to it, learned from it, and worked harder to ensure it never happened again. That's what accountability looks like, Greg. It's not about pretending to be perfect. It's about taking responsibility and growing from your experiences. Her candor left Greg momentarily speechless. The board, clearly moved by her response, seemed to rally behind her. But just when it seemed Greg's downfall was inevitable, an unexpected twist shattered the tension. One of the board members, a senior executive who had been silent throughout the meeting, spoke up. There's another matter we need to discuss, she said, her voice calm but firm. Everyone turned to her, surprised by the interruption. While the evidence presented against Greg is compelling, I've recently received information that implicates another individual in questionable practices, someone who has been quietly influencing company policies behind the scenes. The room tensed as the board member turned a gaze to another executive, a long-serving member of the leadership team. Paul, would you care to explain your role in approving many of Greg's decisions? Paul's face went pale. I was just following protocol, he stammered, but the evidence presented against him was as damning as Greg's. Emails and memos revealed that Paul had not only approved Greg's actions, but had actively participated in shaping policies that enabled discriminatory practices. The revelation shifted the focus, exposing a deeper layer of corruption within the company. Nina realized that while Greg had been the face of the problem, the rot extended further than she'd anticipated. In the end, the board voted unanimously to remove both Greg and Paul from their positions, initiating a sweeping review of company policies and leadership practices. Nina's courage and integrity had sparked a reckoning that went beyond her initial goal, paving the way for a brighter future for Bright Future. As the meeting adjourned, Nina felt a sense of relief, but also a renewed sense of purpose. This was just the beginning of her journey as CEO. The challenges ahead were daunting, but she was ready to face them head-on, knowing that real change required not just vision, but unwavering commitment. And as she left the boardroom, the weight of the past finally lifting, Nina couldn't help but smile. Bright Future had lived up to its name, not because of its history, but because of the possibilities that lay ahead.